For 9 years the girl touched her ear. Every doctor said the same thing. Nothing we can do. Her father spent millions, flew to hospitals across 3 states, begged specialists to look again. They all shrugged. Then a maid noticed something no one else did, and what she found inside that child's ear will leave you speechless. Donald Ferguson was a billionaire. Private jets, estates in Connecticut and Manhattan, more money than most families see in 10 generations. But his daughter Sharon was born deaf. 9 years old, never heard a sound. Donald tried everything. Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Mayo Clinic in Rochester, private neurological labs in Silicon Valley. Specialists who charge more per hour than most people earn in a week. They ran tests, scans, sedated her for procedures. All of them said the same thing. Irreversible, congenital, accept it. But Donald couldn't accept it because Sharon was all he had left. His wife Elaine died 2 days after giving birth to that girl. Complications at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Donald held her hand while the monitors went flat. She'd been trying to say something, her lips moving, but no sound came out. Just like their daughter would be for the rest of her life. So Donald kept searching, kept spending, kept begging God for an answer. What he didn't know, the answer wasn't coming from a hospital. It was coming from the woman he just hired to work in his house. Kimberly Moggensen was a maid, 29. No degree, no credentials, just a woman from outside Duluth, Minnesota, trying to keep her head above water. But she noticed something about Sharon that every specialist had missed. Something in her ear, something dark, something that shouldn't be there. And one evening, while Donald was away in Manhattan, she made a decision that would either save that girl's life or destroy her own. What happened next? I need you to see it for yourself. Before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. The Ferguson estate stretched across 12 acres of Greenwich, Connecticut. From the outside, it looked like a dream. Colonial architecture, windows that caught the afternoon sun, gardens maintained by a staff of 6. But inside, silence, not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that feels like rest. This silence was heavy, suffocating, like something had died and no one wanted to admit it. Servants moved through the hallways without speaking. Their footsteps were careful, measured. They'd learned quickly. Mr. Ferguson preferred things quiet. No music played in that house, no television in the background, no voices carrying from room to room, just silence. And somewhere in that silence, a father was drowning. Donald Ferguson sat in his study most evenings, staring at the portrait above the mahogany desk. There she was, Elaine, his wife, her smile frozen in oil and canvas, her eyes still warm, still alive. Next to her, a younger version of himself, hair not yet gray, hope still visible in his expression, and between them, Sharon, barely 3 years old in the painting. Before Donald understood that his daughter would never hear her mother's name spoken out loud. Elaine died the day Sharon was born. Well, 2 days after. Postpartum complications, the doctors called it. Too much blood loss, systems failing one by one. Donald held her hand in that sterile room while the life drained from her face. She'd been trying to tell him something. Her mouth formed words, but her voice was already gone, just like their daughter's world would be. Donald never forgave himself. If he'd chosen a different hospital, if he'd hired better doctors, if he'd been watching more carefully, maybe Elaine would still be here. Maybe Sharon would be different. The guilt sat in his chest like a weight he couldn't shift, so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He spent money, millions of dollars. The best pediatric specialists on the planet, flights that cost more than cars, hotels where a single night equaled a month's rent for most families. Every doctor said the same thing. Your daughter's deafness is congenital, structural, permanent. There's nothing we can do. You need to accept this, Mr. Ferguson. Accept it. How could he accept that his child would live in silence forever? How could he accept that Sharon would never hear him say, "I'm sorry your mother isn't here. I'm sorry I couldn't save either of you"? So Donald kept searching, kept writing checks, kept hoping that somewhere out there, someone had the answer. He didn't realize the answer wasn't coming from a specialist in a white coat. It was coming from someone he would never think to look at twice. Someone who was about to walk through his front door with nothing but desperation in her heart and bills she couldn't pay. Her name was Kimberly Mogensen, and she was about to change everything. Kimberly arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in October. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that presses down on you, makes everything feel harder than it should. She stood at the iron gate of the Ferguson estate, clutching her bag with both hands, trying to slow her breathing. This was it, her last option. Back in Minnesota, her mother was working double shifts at a nursing facility near Lake Superior. The bills were stacking up on Kimberly's counter like a tower she couldn't stop from growing. 3 months behind on rent, that's what the notice said. If she didn't send money home soon, her mother would lose everything. The woman who raised her alone after Kimberly's father walked out, who worked nights so Kimberly could finish high school, who never once asked for anything in return. That woman deserved better than eviction. So Kimberly took this job, maid at a billionaire's estate. She didn't care about the address or the family name. She just needed the paycheck. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Callahan, met her at the service entrance. Gray hair pulled tight, eyes that missed nothing. The kind of woman who expected perfection and accepted no excuses. "You're Kimberly." "Yes, ma'am." "You're clean." "You'll stay quiet." "You'll keep to yourself." "Mr. Ferguson doesn't like disruptions, especially around his daughter." Kimberly nodded. "I understand. Do you? Because the last girl didn't. She tried to get involved with the child, thought she could fix things. She was terminated within a week." Kimberly swallowed. "I'm just here to work, ma'am." Mrs. Callahan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Follow me." As they walked through the mansion, Kimberly kept her eyes forward, but she couldn't help noticing things. The silence so thick it felt alive. The way other staff members moved without speaking, without smiling, the weight that hung in the air like fog that wouldn't lift. And then she saw her. A small girl sitting at the bottom of the grand staircase, arranging colored blocks in a perfect line. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge anyone passing by. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements precise, isolated. But what caught Kimberly's attention was something else. The way the girl kept touching her right ear, just briefly, almost like a reflex, and the tiny wince that crossed her face each time she did. Kimberly's chest tightened. She'd seen that look before. Years ago, babysitting a boy in St. Louis County whose mother couldn't afford proper medical care. That same gesture, that same pain. She didn't say anything, just kept walking behind Mrs. Callahan. But her heart whispered something she couldn't ignore. Pay attention. Days passed. Kimberly cleaned floors, polished silverware, folded linens in the industrial laundry room. She kept her head down like Mrs. Callahan told her, but she couldn't stop watching Sharon. Every morning, the same routine. The girl would sit alone in the sunroom at the back of the house, surrounded by puzzles and books she couldn't hear read aloud. Her world was small, controlled, safe. No one bothered her there. The other servants avoided her, not out of cruelty, out of fear, like her silence was contagious. Some whispered that the girl was cursed, that losing her mother at birth had taken her hearing too. Superstition, that's all it was. But Kimberly saw something different. She saw a child who was desperately, achingly lonely, and she saw something else. Something the best doctors in America had somehow missed. Donald Ferguson's first flight to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore happened when Sharon was 14 months old. He carried her through the pediatric neurology wing like she was made of glass. The walls were painted soft blue, meant to calm anxious parents, but Donald felt nothing except the weight of hope pressing against his ribs. Dr. Raymond Pritchard was the department head. 40 years of experience. Published in every major journal. His office walls were covered in framed degrees from Harvard, Yale, Stanford. Donald trusted those frames more than he trusted his own instincts. The tests took 6 hours. MRI scans with Sharon strapped to a table, her tiny body sedated so she wouldn't move. EEG monitoring, auditory brainstem response testing. Donald watched through observation glass as technicians in white coats moved around his daughter like she was a specimen. Pritchard finally sat down across from him. His expression was practiced, sympathetic, final. "Mr. Ferguson, your daughter's condition is congenital. The auditory nerve development is structurally compromised. There is no surgical intervention that will restore her hearing. This is permanent." Donald flew to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester 3 months later. Different city, same result. Dr. Vanessa Whitmore used different words, but the same tone: neurological, non-correctable, irreversible. She showed him scans, pointed to shadows and shapes Donald didn't understand. He nodded, anyway. She had credentials. She had authority. She must be right. Palo Alto came next. A private research facility that cost $12,000 just for the consultation. They sedated Sharon again, ran the same tests, came back with the same answer. Then Philadelphia. Then a specialist in Boston who'd worked with deaf children for 30 years. Every single one of them said the same thing. "Accept it, Mr. Ferguson. Your daughter will never hear." And Donald wanted to believe them because the alternative, that they were wrong, that he was spending millions on people who didn't actually know, was too terrifying to consider. So he stopped questioning. He stopped hoping. He just paid. Back home in Greenwich, the house grew quieter. Sharon turned 2, then 3, then 5. She had tutors who taught her sign language. Therapists who worked on her motor skills and social development. A speech coach who tried to help her form words she would never hear herself say. But she had no friends. No plays, no birthday parties with other children. Donald couldn't bear the thought of other parents pitying him. Of their children staring at Sharon, asking why she didn't talk. So he kept her isolated, kept the house sealed off from the world. He removed the television from the main living room. There was no point. Sharon couldn't hear it. The grand piano in the west parlor was covered with a sheet and never touched. The stereo system his wife had loved was disconnected, packed away in storage. Even the grandfather clock in the main hall, the one that chimed every hour, was silenced. Donald unscrewed the pendulum himself one night and put it in a drawer. Silence became the house's default setting. Servants were told to keep conversations to a minimum. No laughter, no raised voices. Nothing that would remind Donald of what his daughter was missing. Sharon grew up in that silence. She learned to read lips, learned to communicate through gestures and written notes. But Donald saw the loneliness in her eyes, saw the way she touched her ear, always the right one, always with that same small wince. He asked doctors about it during follow-up appointments. They said it was a phantom sensation, psychological, nothing to worry about. So he stopped asking. By the time Sharon turned 8, Donald had stopped entering her room at night to check on her. He stopped sitting with her during meals. Not because he didn't love her, because he loved her so much that every moment with her was a reminder of what he'd failed to fix. Of Elaine dying, of Sharon's silence, of his own powerlessness, despite all his wealth. He withdrew into his study, into his work, into the portrait of a family that no longer existed. And Sharon, his beautiful silent daughter, was left to grow up in a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. He never imagined that the answer he'd spent millions searching for was already inside her ear, waiting, hurting her. Growing worse every single day. Kimberly Mogensen grew up in a town called Hermantown, just outside Duluth, Minnesota. Population barely 4,000. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, your business, and exactly how much you owed at the hardware store. Her childhood home was a split-level ranch with siding that needed painting and a furnace that broke every winter. Her mother Diane worked nights at Lakeview Manor, a nursing facility off Highway 53. 12-hour shifts, minimum wage, no benefits. Diane came home smelling like disinfectant and exhaustion, but she never complained. She'd raised Kimberly alone after Kimberly's father left when she was 6, walked out one afternoon for cigarettes, and never came back. Diane taught Kimberly something the schools never did: how to notice pain that other people ignored, how to see when someone was hurting, even if they didn't say a word. Kimberly would visit her mother at work sometimes, sit in the break room doing homework while Diane checked on residents. She watched her mother stop at every room, lean in close, ask questions no one else bothered to ask. "You sleeping okay? That knee still bothering you? You need me to call your son?" Most of the staff walked past those rooms like they were empty. But Diane saw people, and she taught Kimberly to see them too. By the time Kimberly turned 29, she'd worked a dozen jobs: waitress at a diner in Superior, cashier at a Menards in Proctor, house cleaner for a service that paid under the table. None of them lasted. The bills kept coming: rent, utilities. Her mother's medical expenses after a fall at work injured her back. Kimberly was drowning in debt, drowning in late notices, drowning in the fear that she'd end up exactly where she started. That's when she saw the listing: live-in position at a private estate in Connecticut. Housing included. $3,000 a month. No experience required. It felt like a lifeline thrown from a passing boat. She applied that night. 2 weeks later, she was on a Greyhound headed east. Her first days at the Ferguson house felt like walking through a museum after hours. Everything was pristine, untouched, expensive. The other staff members, there were 6 of them, barely acknowledged her. Mrs. Callahan laid out the rules on day 1. You clean the East Wing on Mondays and Thursdays. You stay out of Mr. Ferguson's study. You do not speak unless spoken to, and you do not, under any circumstances, interact with the child. Kimberly asked why. Mrs. Callahan's expression hardened. Because Mr. Ferguson has been through enough. He doesn't need staff members getting attached and giving him false hope. The last girl tried to help, thought she knew better than the doctors. She was gone in 4 days. The warning was clear: keep your distance, do your job, collect your check. But Kimberly couldn't help noticing things. The way the other housekeepers, 2 women named Patrice and Jolene, whispered when they passed Sharon's room. The way the groundskeeper, an older man named Wendell, crossed himself every time he saw the girl through a window. The way silence sat in that house like a living thing, pressing down on everyone inside. Kimberly saw Sharon for the first time on her 3rd day. It was early afternoon. Sunlight came through the tall windows in the sunroom at the back of the house. Sharon sat on the floor near the glass, wearing a red dress with white buttons down the front. Her hair was brushed smooth, pulled back with a velvet band. She looked like a doll, perfect, fragile, untouchable, but it was her eyes that stopped Kimberly cold. Wide, blue, searching, like she was looking for something she'd lost and couldn't remember where she'd put it. Sharon was arranging puzzle pieces on the carpet, fitting them together with careful precision, and then she did it. Reached up with her right hand and touched her ear. Just briefly, a quick press, like she was checking if something was still there, and then the wince. Small, barely visible, but Kimberly saw it. Her chest tightened. She'd seen that exact movement before. Back in Minnesota, babysitting for a neighbor's kid named Trevor Haugen. He'd had an ear infection that went untreated for weeks because his parents couldn't afford the doctor. He used to touch his ear just like that. Same gesture, same pain. Kimberly stood frozen in the hallway, holding a stack of folded towels, watching this little girl in her red dress suffer in silence. Mrs. Callahan walked past and shot her a warning look. "Keep moving," she said. Without saying a word, Kimberly moved. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying in her small room on the 3rd floor, staring at the ceiling, she replayed the moment over and over. The touch, the wince, the loneliness in those wide blue eyes. She whispered into the dark, so quietly no one else could hear. "That's not nothing." Kimberly started keeping track. Not on paper, nothing that could be found, just mental notes. Every time she saw Sharon, she watched. Morning in the sunroom, Sharon touched her right ear. Afternoon in the library, where Sharon sat with picture books, she couldn't hear narrated, same ear, same wince. Evening before dinner, when Sharon sat alone at the bottom of the grand staircase, right hand lifting, fingers pressing just below the earlobe, face tightening for half a second before going blank again. Always the right ear. Always the same spot. Always that flicker of pain she tried to hide. Kimberly noticed something else too, Sharon's loneliness. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. The girl spent hours arranging toys in perfect lines, building towers out of blocks, completing puzzles meant for children twice her age. She never smiled, never ran, never did anything that looked like joy. The other staff avoided her like she carried something contagious. Patrice, the older housekeeper, who'd worked there for 6 years, told Kimberly one afternoon while they folded sheets in the laundry room, "Don't get involved. Mr. Ferguson's been to every doctor in the country. If they couldn't fix her, you sure can't." Jolene, the younger one, who did most of the cooking, nodded. "It's sad, but it's not our place. We're here to clean, not to play doctor." Kimberly didn't argue, but she didn't stop watching either. 2 weeks into the job, Mrs. Callahan assigned Kimberly to help Sharon get ready for a tutoring session. The tutor, a woman named Bryn Kowalski, came 3 times a week to work on sign language and lip reading. Kimberly was told to make sure Sharon was washed and dressed by 10 in the morning. She found Sharon in her bedroom, still in pajamas, sitting on the floor with a stuffed rabbit in her lap. The room was huge, pale pink walls, white furniture, toys stacked neatly on shelves that looked like they'd never been touched. Sharon looked up when Kimberly entered, but didn't move. Kimberly knelt down, made sure Sharon could see her face. "Hi," she signed slowly, one of the few signs she'd looked up online the night before. "Time to get ready." Sharon stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Kimberly helped her pick out clothes, a blue sweater and jeans, then led her to the bathroom down the hall. It was smaller than the main ones, just a guest bath with a single sink and a window that let in soft morning light. Kimberly ran warm water, wet a washcloth, and gently cleaned Sharon's face. Sharon stood perfectly still, used to being handled like an object. But when Kimberly moved to clean behind her ears, Sharon flinched. Hard, her whole body went rigid, her hand flying up to cover her right ear. Kimberly froze. "I'm sorry," she said, even though Sharon couldn't hear her. She pulled back, gave Sharon space. But Sharon's hand stayed pressed against her ear, her eyes squeezed shut. Her mouth opened slightly, like she was trying not to cry. Kimberly's heart pounded. She leaned in slowly, carefully, and touched Sharon's wrist. "It's okay. Let me see." Sharon hesitated, then slowly lowered her hand. Kimberly turned Sharon's head gently toward the window where the light was brightest. She leaned in close, tilted her head, and looked. At first, she didn't see anything unusual, just a normal ear canal, maybe a little red from irritation. But then Sharon shifted slightly, and the angle changed, and Kimberly saw it. Something dark, deep inside. Not soft tissue, not wax, something solid, something that didn't belong. Kimberly's breath caught, her stomach dropped. She pulled back, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She'd seen this before. Years ago, back in Minnesota, a boy named Trevor Haugen, 7 years old, son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs and couldn't afford regular doctor visits. Trevor had complained about his ear for weeks. His mother thought it was an infection, tried home remedies, waited for it to pass. By the time someone finally looked, really looked, there was a small bead lodged so deep it had caused permanent damage. The memory hit Kimberly like a punch. That same dark shape, that same embedded object, that same pain, no one had bothered to investigate. She looked at Sharon, standing there in her blue sweater, trusting and silent and hurting. This little girl had been to Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, the best specialists money could buy. And not one of them had seen this. Or maybe they had seen it and decided it wasn't worth mentioning. Not worth the paperwork. Not worth the liability. Kimberly's hands were still shaking. She finished washing Sharon's face quickly, helped her get dressed, walked her downstairs to meet Bryn Kowalski. But her mind wasn't in the room anymore. This wasn't deafness, this wasn't congenital or neurological or any of those polished words doctors had used to explain away a child's suffering. This was neglect. This was a system that had failed so completely, so catastrophically, that a 9-year-old girl had spent years in pain, and no one had cared enough to look closely. Kimberly stood in the hallway outside the tutoring room, her back against the wall, her chest tight with anger and fear. She whispered to herself, barely audible, they knew. They had to know. Patrice noticed first. She cornered Kimberly in the hallway outside the laundry room 3 days after the bathroom incident. "You're spending too much time with the girl," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one else was listening. Kimberly kept folding towels. "I'm just doing what Mrs. Callahan assigned me." Patrice shook her head. "No, you're doing more than that. I've seen you. Sitting with her in the sunroom, helping her with things she doesn't need help with." "You need to stop." "Why?" Kimberly asked, meeting her eyes. "Because Mr. Ferguson has one rule. No false hope. He's spent years, millions of dollars, trying to fix what can't be fixed. He doesn't need some maid coming in here thinking she knows better than doctors." Jolene appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Patrice is right. The last girl who tried to help got fired on the spot. Mr. Ferguson doesn't tolerate interference. You're here to clean, not to save anyone." Kimberly wanted to argue, wanted to tell them what she'd seen, but the words stuck in her throat. These women had been here longer. They knew the rules. They knew the cost of breaking them, so she nodded, understood. But she didn't stop. Sharon started seeking her out. Small things at first. Bringing Kimberly a book to look at. Sitting near her while Kimberly dusted the library shelves. Following her with those wide blue eyes like Kimberly was the only person in the house who saw her as more than a problem to be managed. One afternoon, Sharon handed Kimberly a drawing. It was a picture of 2 people holding hands. One tall, one small. Kimberly's chest tightened. She knelt down so Sharon could see her face and smiled. "This is beautiful," she signed slowly. Sharon smiled back. It was the first time Kimberly had seen her smile. That night, Mrs. Callahan pulled Kimberly aside after dinner. "I've been told you're forming an attachment to Sharon." Kimberly's pulse quickened. "I'm just being kind." Mrs. Callahan's expression didn't soften. "Kind is fine. Involved is not. Mr. Ferguson has been very clear. His daughter's condition is permanent. He's accepted that. You need to accept it too. If you can't, this job isn't for you." The threat was clear. Back off or leave. Kimberly lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her small 3rd-floor room. She needed this job. Needed the money. Her mother back in Minnesota was counting on her. $3,000 a month was more than Kimberly had ever made. Losing it meant losing everything. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sharon's face. The wince, the pain, the thing embedded deep in her ear that no one wanted to acknowledge. Kimberly was torn. Stay quiet and keep the paycheck. Or do something and risk it all. Sharon's pain got worse. Kimberly noticed it during breakfast one morning. Sharon barely touched her food, kept pressing her hand against her ear, her face pale. By midday she was sitting in the corner of the sunroom with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly. Kimberly tried to approach her, but Mrs. Callahan intercepted. "Leave her alone. The tutor will handle it." But the tutor, Bryn Kowalski, didn't handle it. She showed up at 2, took one look at Sharon, and suggested they skip the session. "The child isn't focused today," she told Mrs. Callahan before leaving. No one called a doctor. No one checked on Sharon. She was just left alone in that sunroom, curled up in pain while the house went about its business. That evening, Donald Ferguson left for Manhattan. A fundraiser at the Plaza Hotel, something about infrastructure grants and political donors. He walked past Sharon without stopping, his face blank, detached. Kimberly watched from the hallway as his car pulled away, red taillights disappearing down the long driveway. The house felt different after he left, quieter, heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. By 9, most of the staff had gone home. Only Patrice and Wendell remained, both in their quarters on the far side of the estate. Kimberly was alone on the second floor, finishing her nightly rounds. She checked Sharon's room. The girl was in bed, but she wasn't asleep. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, her right hand pressed against her ear. Tears ran silently down her cheeks. Kimberly stepped closer. Sharon didn't respond, couldn't hear her, but she turned her head slightly, saw Kimberly, and reached out with her free hand. Kimberly took it. Sharon's grip was tight, desperate, and then Sharon's body convulsed. Her back arched. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. She collapsed onto the bed, trembling, her hand still clutching Kimberly's. Kimberly's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't think, didn't weigh the consequences, didn't consider the rules. She just acted. The house was so quiet Kimberly could hear her own heartbeat. Sharon lay on the bed, her small body still trembling, tears streaming down her face without sound. Her right hand pressed hard against her ear, knuckles white from the pressure. Kimberly knelt beside the bed, her mind racing. She could call Mrs. Callahan, wake Patrice, try to reach Donald in Manhattan, but she knew what would happen. They'd tell her to wait until morning. They'd say Sharon had episodes like this before. They'd remind her that the best doctors in America had already examined the girl and found nothing they could fix. But Kimberly had seen it. That dark solid thing embedded deep in Sharon's ear, and she knew, with a certainty that burned in her chest, that it was killing this child slowly. Day by day, year by year. Sharon's eyes found hers. Desperate, pleading, trusting. Kimberly made her decision. She stood up, legs unsteady, and walked quickly down the hallway to the supply closet near the guest bathroom. Her hands shook as she opened the door. Inside, on the second shelf, was a white medical kit, standard emergency supplies, bandages, antiseptic, tweezers, gauze. She grabbed the kit and a small flashlight from the utility drawer. Then she paused, hand on the door frame, and looked back down the empty hallway. The estate felt like a cathedral at midnight, silent, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. If she did this, she could lose everything. Her job, her paycheck, her only chance to help her mother back in Minnesota. Worse, if something went wrong, if she hurt Sharon, she could face charges. Assault, practicing medicine without a license. Donald Ferguson had enough money and enough lawyers to destroy her completely. But if she didn't do this, Sharon would keep suffering, keep living in pain, keep touching that ear and wincing and crying silent tears while everyone around her looked away. Kimberly walked back to Sharon's room. The door was still open. Sharon hadn't moved. She lay on her side now, curled into herself, her breathing shallow and quick. Kimberly sat on the edge of the bed and set the medical kit down beside her. She opened it carefully, hands still shaking, and pulled out a pair of sterilized tweezers sealed in plastic. Then the antiseptic wipes. Then the gauze. She turned on the flashlight and tested it. The beam was bright, focused. Good. Sharon watched her with wide, frightened eyes. She didn't understand what Kimberly was doing, but she didn't pull away either. Kimberly touched Sharon's shoulder gently, made sure the girl could see her face. "I need to look at your ear," she signed slowly, using the limited signs she'd learned. "It might hurt, but I think I can help you." Sharon stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. Kimberly's throat tightened. She unwrapped the tweezers, her fingers clumsy, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wiped them down with antiseptic, even though they were already sterile. She needed to do this right, needed to be careful, needed to not make things worse. She positioned the flashlight on the nightstand, angled so it would shine directly into Sharon's ear. Then she helped Sharon lie on her left side, her right ear facing up. Sharon's breathing quickened, her hands gripped the bedsheet. Kimberly leaned in close, holding the flashlight with one hand and the tweezers with the other. The light illuminated the ear canal. She could see it now, clearer than before. Dark, compacted, lodged deep. Her hands were shaking so badly, she had to stop and take a breath. She closed her eyes for a second and prayed, not out loud, just a silent, desperate plea to whatever God might be listening. "Please don't let me hurt her. Please let this work. Please." She opened her eyes. Sharon was watching her, tears still wet on her cheeks, but her expression had changed. She wasn't scared anymore. She was hopeful. That hope terrified Kimberly more than anything else. Because if she failed, if she made this worse, she'd be taking that hope away. And Sharon had so little of it left. Kimberly steadied her hand. She leaned in closer, angling the tweezers carefully, her breath held, her entire body rigid with focus. The edge of the tweezers touched the obstruction. It was solid, hard, bigger than she'd expected. She adjusted her grip, positioned the tips more precisely. Sharon whimpered, a small sound Kimberly felt more than heard. "I'm sorry," Kimberly whispered. "I'm so sorry." She tightened her grip on the tweezers. This was it. The moment everything would either break or heal, the moment she'd either save a child or ruin both their lives. Kimberly began to pull. The tweezers gripped something solid. Kimberly held her breath, steadied her hand, and pulled. Slowly, carefully, a millimeter at a time. Sharon's body went rigid. Her hands clutched the sheets. A sound escaped her throat, raw and guttural, pain she couldn't express any other way. Kimberly's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The obstruction was moving, but it was lodged tight. She adjusted the angle slightly, trying not to scrape the ear canal, trying not to cause more damage than had already been done. Another pull, another millimeter. The object shifted. Sharon's breathing turned ragged. Her chest heaved, but she didn't pull away. She stayed still, trusting Kimberly even through the pain. One more pull, firm but controlled. And then suddenly, it gave. The obstruction came free, sliding out in one piece, dark and compacted and larger than Kimberly had imagined. She held it up to the light, her hands shaking, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It was hard, dense, years old. How had no one seen this? How had it been missed by every specialist, every scan, every examination? But there was no time to think about that, because Sharon was moving. She gasped. A sharp, sudden inhale, like she'd been underwater and just broke the surface. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened. And then she heard the heating system kicked on. A low mechanical hum that filled the room. Sharon's head whipped toward the vent in the ceiling. Her expression shifted from confusion to shock, to something Kimberly couldn't name. Wonder maybe, or terror, or both. Kimberly set the tweezers down, hands still trembling. Sharon turned toward her. Slowly, her eyes locked on Kimberly's face. Her lips moved, forming a single word. "What? You can hear me," Kimberly whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, you can hear me." Sharon's hands flew to her ears. Both of them, she pressed. Released, pressed again, like she was testing whether this was real. The heating system hummed. Footsteps sounded in the hallway below, probably Wendell doing his nightly rounds. Sharon's head turned toward every sound, tracking it, her face a mix of fear and disbelief. And then she spoke. "Daddy," it came out soft, uncertain, like she wasn't sure her own voice was real. But Kimberly heard it, clear as day. Kimberly collapsed onto the floor beside the bed, sobbing. She covered her face with her hands, her whole body shaking. 9 years. 9 years this child had lived in silence because of something that could have been removed in minutes. Sharon sat up, looking around the room like she was seeing it for the first time. The ticking of the small clock on the dresser, the creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of wind against the windows. Every noise was new, every sound a revelation. She whispered, again, "Daddy," louder, this time. And that's when Donald Ferguson walked through the door. He'd come home early. The fundraiser had ended sooner than expected. He was still in his suit, tie loosened, exhaustion written across his face. But when he saw Kimberly on the floor, when he saw the blood on her hands, when he saw the tweezers and the medical kit and Sharon sitting up in bed, staring at him, everything stopped. "What did you do?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Kimberly tried to stand, tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Donald's eyes moved to Sharon, then to the small dark object sitting on the nightstand, then back to Kimberly. "What did you do?" He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed Kimberly by the arm, pulling her to her feet. His grip was iron. His face was white with rage. Get out of this house right now." But Sharon screamed, not a silent cry, not a voiceless gasp, a real audible scream that tore through the room like a siren. Donald froze, his hand released Kimberly's arm. He turned slowly toward his daughter. Sharon was standing now, tears pouring down her face, her hands reaching toward him. "Daddy," she said again, her voice breaking. "Daddy, I can hear you." Donald staggered backward, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Sharon, at Kimberly, at the blood, at the object on the nightstand. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees. Sharon ran to him, threw her arms around his neck. "I can hear you," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I can hear you, Daddy." Donald's hands came up slowly, like he was afraid she'd disappear if he moved too fast. He held her, and then he broke. Completely. His body shook with sobs he'd been holding back for 9 years. The door burst open. Patrice appeared, eyes wide, Wendell right behind her. Mrs. Callahan pushed past them both, took one look at the scene, and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling security," she said. "And the police." Kimberly stood in the corner, blood still on her hands, her entire body numb. She'd done it. She'd saved Sharon. But she'd also just destroyed her own life. Sharon pulled back from her father, looked at Kimberly through her tears, and said the only thing that mattered. "Thank you." The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes. Paramedics rushed into Sharon's room, equipment in hand, radios crackling. Donald held Sharon close, refusing to let go even as they tried to examine her. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "I can hear the sirens. I can hear everything." One of the paramedics, a woman named Kerry Lindstrom, knelt beside Sharon and spoke softly. "Sweetie, can you tell me your name?" Sharon turned toward the voice instantly, her eyes locked on Kerry's face. "Sharon Ferguson." Kerry's expression shifted. She looked at her partner, then at Donald. "Sir, your daughter is responding to auditory stimuli." Donald's voice was hoarse. "She was deaf. She's been deaf her entire life." Kerry examined Sharon's right ear with a small light. "There's irritation here, recent trauma, but the canal is clear now." She looked at Donald. "Sir, I think your daughter can hear." They transported Sharon to Greenwich Hospital. Donald rode in the ambulance, holding Sharon's hand the entire way. Kimberly was placed in a security vehicle, wrists zip-tied, Mrs. Callahan sitting across from her with a look of cold satisfaction. At the hospital, doctors ran tests, auditory response. tympanometry, pure tone audiometry. Dr. Howard Brenneman, the attending physician, came out after 2 hours. His face was pale. "Mr. Ferguson, your daughter's hearing is functional. There's some inflammation in the right ear canal, likely from a recent extraction, but structurally, everything appears intact." Donald stared at him. "That's impossible. She was examined by the best specialists in the country. Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic. They all said she was born deaf." Dr. Brenneman hesitated. "Sir, I'd like to request her medical records. All of them. They arrived by morning. Thick files from Baltimore, Rochester, Palo Alto, Philadelphia." Dr. Brenneman reviewed them in his office while Donald sat across from him, exhausted and unraveling. Sharon was asleep in a nearby room, monitored by nurses who kept checking on her because they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Dr. Brenneman set down a file from a clinic in Pennsylvania. His hands were shaking. "Mr. Ferguson, there's a notation here from a scan performed 4 years ago, June 2021. The radiologist identified a foreign object in the right ear canal, high-density mass. Recommended follow-up with an ENT specialist." Donald's blood went cold. "What?" Dr. Brenneman turned the file toward him. "The note is right here, but there's no record of any follow-up. No additional scans, no removal procedure. Nothing." Donald's hands gripped the edge of the desk. They knew. They saw it and did nothing. "It appears that way, yes." Donald stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. His vision blurred. His chest felt like it was caving in. 4 years. For 4 years, Sharon had been in pain, had been trapped in silence, because someone decided a notation in a file wasn't worth acting on. The rage came first, hot and blinding. Then the shame. He'd trusted them, paid them, believed every word they said, and they'd let his daughter suffer because it was easier. Because it was more profitable to keep running tests than to actually solve the problem. He thought of Elaine. Thought of her dying in that hospital while he stood by helpless. Thought of all the money he'd spent, all the specialists he'd flown to, all the hope he'd poured into a system that had failed him twice. And then he thought of Kimberly. She was being held in a small room on the ground floor. Hospital security had been called. The Greenwich Police Department was involved. Mrs. Callahan had pressed charges. Assault. Practicing medicine without a license. Reckless endangerment of a minor. Donald walked down the hallway, past nurses who stepped aside when they saw his face, past administrators who tried to stop him. He pushed open the door to the holding room. Kimberly sat in a plastic chair, hands still zip-tied, eyes red from crying. A police officer stood near the door. Mrs. Callahan sat in the corner, arms crossed. Donald looked at the officer. "Cut her loose." "Sir, we can't do that until—" "I said, cut her loose, now." The officer hesitated, then pulled out a knife and sliced through the zip ties. Kimberly rubbed her wrists, confused, terrified. Donald turned to Mrs. Callahan. "You're fired. Get out." Mrs. Callahan's mouth fell open. "Mr. Ferguson, she assaulted your daughter. She saved my daughter. You and every other person in my house stood by and did nothing while Sharon suffered. Now get out, before I have you removed." Mrs. Callahan stood face red with anger and stormed out. Donald turned back to Kimberly. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." Donald knelt in front of her. His voice broke. "You did what I should have done years ago. You looked, you cared, you acted, and because of you, my daughter can hear." He covered his face with his hands. "I'm the one who's sorry." Donald brought Kimberly to Sharon's room himself. The hospital hallway was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the shuffle of nurses' shoes against linoleum. Sharon was awake, sitting up in bed, headphones resting around her neck. A nurse had given them to her, so she could listen to music for the first time in her life. When Sharon saw Kimberly, her face lit up. She pulled the headphones off and reached out both arms. Kimberly crossed the room quickly, tears already falling, and wrapped Sharon in a hug. The girl buried her face in Kimberly's shoulder and cried. Not silent tears this time. Real sobs that filled the room with sound. "Thank you," Sharon whispered. "Thank you for not walking away." Kimberly held her tighter. I couldn't leave you like that." Donald stood in the doorway watching them. His throat was tight. His chest ached. This woman, this maid from Minnesota, who had nothing, who risked everything, had done what he and all his money never could. She'd paid attention. She'd cared enough to act. He stepped into the room. Sharon looked up, still holding Kimberly's hand. "Daddy," she said, her voice stronger now. "I can hear your footsteps. I can hear you breathing. I can hear everything." Donald sat on the edge of the bed. He took her other hand. "I'm so sorry, Sharon. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I trusted people who didn't deserve it. I'm sorry I let you suffer for so long." Sharon shook her head. "You didn't know. I should have known." Donald's voice broke. "I should have looked harder. I should have believed you were in pain. But I was so scared of hoping for something that might not happen. I stopped hoping at all." He turned to Kimberly. "And you," he said. "You saved my daughter when I couldn't. I'll never be able to repay that." Kimberly wiped her eyes. "I don't need repayment, Mr. Ferguson. I just needed her to stop hurting." The charges were dropped that afternoon. Donald made a single phone call, and the entire case disappeared. He offered Kimberly a permanent position. Not as a maid, as Sharon's companion. Triple the salary. Her own quarters, a car, health insurance. Money sent home to her mother every month. Kimberly accepted. Not because of the money, because Sharon asked her to stay. They went home 3 days later. The Ferguson estate looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything had changed. Donald gave orders immediately. The grandfather clock in the main hall was restarted. Its chime rang out every hour, deep and resonant. Sharon stood beneath it, the first time it struck, eyes closed, smiling. The piano in the west parlor was uncovered. Donald hired a teacher. Within weeks, Sharon was picking out simple melodies, laughing every time she hit the wrong note because she could hear the mistake. Music played in the house again. Not loud, not intrusive, just present. Sharon would walk from room to room, listening to the way sound moved through the space. She'd stand by windows and listen to birds. Sit in the garden and hear wind through the trees. She discovered rain, thunder, her own laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Donald threw a small dinner party, just a few people, old friends he'd pushed away years ago. Sharon sat at the table and listened to conversations, her head turning toward every voice, her eyes bright with focus. Someone told a joke, and the room filled with laughter. Sharon laughed too, not because she understood the joke, but because she could finally hear what joy sounded like. Kimberly sat beside her, watching, her heart full in a way she'd never experienced before. Patrice and Jolene had been let go. Wendell stayed on, but kept his distance. The house had a new rhythm now. Lighter, warmer, alive. One evening, Donald called Sharon and Kimberly into his study. The portrait of Elaine still hung above the desk, but Donald wasn't staring at it anymore. He was looking at them, at his daughter, who could hear, at the woman who'd given her that gift. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what happened, about how close we came to never knowing. And I realized something. All the money in the world, all the specialists, all the credentials and degrees, none of it mattered. What mattered was someone paying attention, someone caring enough to look closely." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Compassion saved my daughter. Not money, not power, just compassion." Sharon reached across the desk and took his hand. "And you, Daddy, you saved me too. By listening, by believing." Donald looked at Kimberly. "You taught me something I'd forgotten, that the people we overlook are often the ones who see the most." Kimberly smiled. "I just did what anyone should do. But you're the only one who did, Donald said quietly. That night, Sharon asked Kimberly to read her a bedtime story. Not sign it, read it out loud. Kimberly sat on the edge of Sharon's bed, the lamp casting soft light across the pages, and read. Sharon closed her eyes and listened, her face peaceful, her breathing steady. When the story ended, Sharon whispered, "I love you, Kimberly." Kimberly's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, sweetheart." Downstairs, Donald stood in the main hall as the grandfather clock struck 10. Each chime filled the house, warm and familiar. He closed his eyes and listened. And for the first time since Elaine died, he heard something he thought he'd lost forever. Forgiveness, spoken out loud. In his daughter's voice,